Everybody, it's great to be back here again. Tomorrow it's Friday, Parashat Pinchas. This week was a very, very powerful week. We all know when Netanyahu addressed the Congress and there's a change. Biden stepped aside now for Harris to now represent the Democratic Party. Just recently in Europe there's been elections as well. There's a lot of political events stirring in the world, not only the war that's going on here in the Middle East, which is obviously the major event that's going on now, because this is just, as Netanyahu put it straight out, is Israel's fighting the battles for the world. It's good against evil here. But I want to focus in the portion, and connect to, of course it all connects in the portion, and something stood out. There's a lot to talk about here. It opens up with Pinchas and Phineas, with his challenge, which we saw at the end of last week's portion, against the Midianite woman who was the daughter of Kozbi Batsur of Tzur. Midrash said it was Balak, and Zimri ben Salu. Zimri was one of the heads of the very important family in the tribe of Shimon. He was a prince, and Pinchas reacts with a very harsh reaction, and he was able, because of his zealous action, he was able to stay the plague, and there's a lot of discussion amongst our rabbis about, did he have the right to do so, that, and there's a law saying, kanem pogimbo, I'm not going to go there, I think I've spoken about this in the past. That's a question in itself. How do we relate to zealousy and zealous acts? But as a result, we see right away, as a result of Pinchas' initiative over here, which we'll talk more about. I want to talk more about the results than exactly the details which led to those results, which would be a different lesson in itself. But if we see, Pinchas was granted a Brit Shalom. God gave him the covenant of the peace covenant. What is the peace covenant? Briti Shalom. God gave Pinchas a blessing of peace. So you have to understand what it is. God doesn't have a covenant called peace, but he gave Pinchas a covenant of peace itself, right? What was this covenant? And there are different explanations on what he was blessed with. And Rashi says, obviously to all explanations, he was given an everlasting priesthood. And we know, brought down in Divrei Yamim Chronicles, is that all the children of Pinchas, they were the high priests. It wasn't that there were no high priests that came from other priests of Itamar, for example. There were, but Pinchas, this went on for until the end of the destruction, until the destruction of the temple. But his progeny were the high priests, mainly from coming his lineage, and that was a great blessing of Pinchas. And others explain, and we all know this is a very interesting question. Is Pinchas, and I want to talk more about Elijah this week's portion, connected together, because there are those who say, our rabbis teach us that Pinchas is Elijah. Now, it's interesting, what does that mean when our rabbis say Pinchas is Elijah? There are other opinions, but that's one very powerful opinion that everyone remembers and knows about that. There is something very special about the zealousy of Elijah, as we all know as well. And there's a connection between Pinchas and Elijah, Eliyahu in Hebrew. So I want to discuss that. But we see here the gift that was given to Pinchas was this everlasting priesthood, and according to what the Sforno says down, was also a gift, of course, of, if it was Elijah, it was like everlasting life. He never died, or according to all opinions, he lived a very, very long life. We find Pinchas alive for hundreds of years, and we see him alive in the book of Judges. And there are stories where we read about Pinchas there as well. So it's very interesting that blessing gave him a very, very long lifespan. If we don't explain him as Elijah, but even without explaining it, he was blessed with a long lifespan, very long. And that's one particular thing that we're going to get to in a moment. I want to just mention a few other cases in the portion where, well, first of all, we see from Pinchas, his actions, that there was initiative taken on his part to react to a very, very terrible situation that was going on in the camp of Israel. They were idol worshipping, they were committing sexual offenses, and he came and he reacted and he stopped the plague. So he took a tremendous, also he endangered his life tremendously, because obviously he ended up killing the Midianite woman who was the daughter of a king. And Zimri was from the tribe of Shimon, a leader. So obviously he didn't think about his own personal self. He just thought about one thing: stopping the terrible disgrace that was going on. And that gave him this great blessing. He took a great initiative. Now, if we see a couple of other, there are 4 other examples here I want to bring down in the portion of initiative. And we see one very interesting. It's only mentioned in 3 words. It says in this week's portion that the children of Korach didn't die. Right. So here we're also talking about not only like initiative, we're talking about the next generation. Right. Pinchas was already the son of Elazar, the 3rd generation from Moshe Rabbeinu. Right. It was Aaron's son was Elazar, and then it was basically Aaron's grandson. So it was the 3rd generation from Moshe and Aaron. So we see it's a young generation responding here, and that's one example. Another example, which I mentioned a second ago, is the children of Korach. The children of Korach, it says they did not die. Now, what was this whole story of the children of Korach? And Rashi brings down, I want to find this Rashi for you, I want to bring it down. Rashi talks about how, let me first, I'll quote the Rashi exactly, but it's very simple. It's a known Rashi, very straightforward Rashi. I mean, is that basically the children had Hilei Tshuva. They began to do self-reflection. When the father, Korach, went off the road path and he was doing the wrong thing, the children of Korach said, we can't go along with this. In the beginning they went with it, and they said, listen, we have to pull away from this. And that was a tremendous to think about it. And I think I once mentioned this in one of my classes, is that, okay, when a person does the right thing, it's one thing, but when you're going against your own father, that's a very, very hard challenge. And the children of Korach were able to literally, there's an expression in the Talmud, divrei harav, divrei hatalmid, divrei mi shomim. If there's an argument between the rabbi and the student, who do you listen to? And you listen to, of course, the rabbi, right? Because more than the student. So here, God is telling you something, and your father's a student, right? So God said, you have to follow God and do the right thing. And they found the strength, which is fascinating, to to do that, and that's what granted them that. It saved their life, basically. They went down, but they grabbed onto the pit, and they were there, and they were able to come out. So that's fascinating, as we see in the Psalms that they were alive. So we see here tshuva, again, a tremendous, I will call it a yosma, initiative on the young generation to make decisions, very important decisions, and the right decisions. It's another example. If we go on, is there any other examples? I'll put the question out, you can think about it. Any other examples over here that talk about this in the portion? And the answer is, of course. One, there are other examples, and another one is, of course, the daughters of Tzlofchad. The daughters of Tzlofchad, when their father died in the desert, I've spoken about in the past, who was Tzlofchad exactly? What did he do? We spoke about this. And the question is, they could have remained, silent and not said anything, but they right away, they came over and they came to, they stood before Moshe Rabbeinu, and they were saying, and they stood before Elazar, and they said, literally, our father died in the desert, etc. And why should they lose the inheritance of the father? If they wouldn't be giving a part of the land of Israel, then they would basically, their father would not have any inheritance in the land. And Moshe Rabbeinu, God answers Moshe Rabbeinu and says, yes, they're right, and give them the inheritance to the land. So we see here something very powerful, an initiative. The love of the land of the daughters of Tzlofchad. If we think about what we've seen until now, we've seen those who turned their back to the land of Israel, that wanted to go back for the gefilte fish in Egypt and all those kind of things. But on the other hand, the daughters of Tzlofchad were so devoted to their love of the land, and they were not willing to compromise in any way. They said, we want inheritance, and they demanded that inheritance to the land in their unusual circumstance. So they took that initiative again, the young generation, taking the initiative of showing their love to the land of Israel, and they inherited. Our rabbis say that they inherited 3 portions of the land. They got a very special inheritance, and it has to do. I'm not going to go all the details explaining that, but it worked. If you look in the Bava Batra, there's a tractate that talks about the laws of inheritance. Right now, those who are studying Daf Yomi are actually learning Bava Batra, and they'll get to that Mishnah, which talks about, that how that she inherited 3 portions of the land, and so that was a big blessing they got. As I sneezed on, they got that big blessing as a result of the love for the land. They inherited 3 portions of it. Now, there's another example I want to bring down. So we spoke about Pinchas, we spoke about the sons of Korach, we spoke about the daughters of Tzlofchad. Is there any other examples in the portion that show us this initiative on the young generation? And yes, there's another one. It doesn't. If you don't pay attention, you'll probably skip over this one. And that's when God decides and says, okay, we see that, tells Moshe Rabbeinu in this week's portion, that he's not going to be able to enter the land of Israel, that whole generation of the desert, will not enter the land. And God tells him, to appoint, to appoint Yoshua to be the leader instead. Now Moshe Rabbeinu, if you look in chapter 27, Moshe Rabbeinu says to God, after God tells him he's not going to enter the land, so Moshe Rabbeinu says, "Vaydaber Moshe LaShem leimo, yifkod Hashem Elokehu l'chol basa ish al ha'edah." So Moshe Rabbeinu is suggesting, God should choose a leader over the congregation. And obviously Rashi brings out right away that he was referring, he thought about, I'll read Rashi. Rashi says, "Kevan shema Moshe shema lo makom tein nachlat tzlofcha lebnotav." When Moshe Rabbeinu hears that God ruled that give the daughters of Tzlofcha inheritance, so he said the hour has come that I'll also request for my particular request that his children will inherit his greatness. So Moshe Rabbeinu said, okay, now it's time for me to speak out. And God says to him, "Malo kadosh baruch hu lo kach alta b'machshava lefanai." Here, this is not what I thought. Kedayu Yoshua litol sachar. Yeshua is worthy of receiving the reward of being leadership. Why? Shimusho, because he has served you. Shalom mash metocho. Joshua was literally a person who was mishamesh. There's an expression mishamesh tamdei chachamim. He did not leave the tent of study, and he was learning from all that. And as King Solomon says in Proverbs 27:18, "Noser teina yochal pirya." Right. If someone watches over the fruit, he will, the fig, he will eat the fruit. So in other words, he was watching over Moshe Rabbeinu, learning from him, and all that shimush, all that serving his master, and he was deserving. So we see here again, which is very interesting, is that it was here is slightly different than the other cases, but again, the young generation of leadership that now God was putting in position here was a result here of being worthy of your actions, because of your actions, right? In all the first 3 cases we spoke about, the actions of Pinchas, the actions of the daughters of Tzlofcha, the actions of the children of Korach that repented, right? So those actions were all actions where, that were worthy because of their actions. It brought them the special results that they deserve, the reward that they received. And the same thing here. The Joshua wasn't even aware that he would obviously here it's different that he didn't think about he's going to be the next leader. It probably didn't cross his mind because he knew that Moshe Rabbeinu had children. But here his actions speak for themselves. The actions went ahead and did the work for him. Is the fact that he was such a devoted servant in the tent of Torah, serving again Moshe Rabbeinu as being a servant of God, of course, but serving Moshe, learning from him. We say there's a concept in Jewish literature from the Talmud being l'shamesh talmidei chachamim we spoke about, right? When someone serves those who study Torah, that's a very big ma'ala, a big how to explain ma'ala? It's words how to explain. It's a very big level, to do such a thing. It's very worthy to do that. It's a great thing to do, and that's what actually granted Joshua that he will be the next leader of Israel. So we see in all cases, it was the actions of the individuals that obviously brought them, that changed reality, that had the power of literally changing reality. Because, for example, and the fascinating thing of Pinchas is that he wasn't. If you can look if you look at the way the priesthood was chosen, it was all the children of Aaron. After Aaron was chosen as priest, so his children that were born afterwards, they would naturally they would remain priests forever. But Pinchas was different because he was already born. So he wasn't in that way chosen priest. He had to earn his priesthood. And once he earned his priesthood, it became an everlasting inheritance on his part. Right? That was again the unusual thing there. The same thing applied again to the children of Korach. They had to earn their survival. They wouldn't have survived. They would have fallen like the rest of the congregation of Korach if it wasn't for their actions that pulled them out of there. And the daughters of Tzlofchad, if they wouldn't have come forward, they wouldn't have received an importance, in a portion of the land. They had to take that initiative. And Joshua, here, as I mentioned before, if it wasn't for his special way of serving Moshe Rabbeinu, right, then the leadership would have been passed on to someone else, perhaps one of the children of Moshe. But he earned it through his special behavior, special holiness that he was. So this great lesson of action, leading, that's a new generation. It's a very important lesson here. That if we want in this world, obviously we serve our master, as it says in Pirkei Avot, and not to receive reward, right? That's not the purpose. But when people, and obviously Pinchas, the last thing in his mind was he's going to receive the priesthood. That was a total surprise. God granted him the priesthood. And also the same thing, the children of Korach didn't know they would survive. They were going down there in the pits, in the dungeon over there, and basically, they had their minds when that happened, when they were down there, that they did the wrong thing, and so God just saved them. They latched on to one of the sides of that big pit, and they were able to get out. So that again was a surprise. So they didn't believe they would be getting out of there. They would be alive. And the daughters of Chad here, it's interesting also. So they come along and they're speaking out. They're trying their best. They don't know, they don't know what's going to be the outcome, but they're trying. And God grants them that gift of getting a part of the land of Israel. Not only one, but they got 3 portions, as I mentioned to you. So that's fascinating. And the same thing, of course, Joshua didn't believe he'd be didn't cross his mind, and all of a sudden, boom. So we see, on one hand, the actions you don't do actions because of the reward that's going to come, but you have to do the right thing. And the right thing is the right thing. Eventually, we see the formula. When you do the right thing, you will merit in blessing. And the daughters of Tzlofchad, for example, their whole thing was the love for the land. They wanted so badly a portion of the land of Israel. They weren't willing to compromise, and that powerful initiative, aggressive behavior, fighting for your rights, will bring you the proper blessing. So that's interesting, of 4 different cases in the portion that all have connected to actions. But I want to talk about one other thing, which is a question that came to my mind the whole time, and getting back to Pinchas. As I said before, Pinchas is Elijah. We know that Pinchas is Elijah the prophet. And, our rabbis say it's brought down in certain sources, very clearly, Pinchas is Eliyahu, as we all know. Now, the connections of Eliyahu and Pinchas are clear. I mean, we see the connections of the zealousy, right, that we see in the Bible clearly. Elijah was a very zealous prophet, as we know. And that actually, and this is really the question I'm going to ask, is why on one hand, now again, we don't have to explain that Eliyahu 100% was Pinchas. I said, so it's a direction of certain commentaries in our sages. But there are others that explain it simply that, that they weren't, they weren't the same person, but there were similarities there. The Kabbalistic approach is that they come from the same root of the soul. But anyway, my question is this. Obviously the question is good on both sides, whether it's Elijah is Pinchas or whether another, a totally different individual, but connected to the same root soul, is why do we see a blessing of the everlasting priesthood? He was given a gift, Pinchas, for what he did. But on the other hand, if we look at the story of Elijah, when his zealous act, God, responds differently there. And I'd quickly like to run over there for a moment. And brought down in Kings 1, chapter 18, and we're going to read about it. With the reason I'm mentioning Elijah, because it's this week's prophet we're going to read, connected to the portions. A lot of connections between Elijah, that story, and the portion of the week, because I told you again, it's connected to Pinchas. Now, if we look in that chapter 18, we know it talks about how, we'll give you a little background first. We know the story where the Nevi'im, the false prophets of the Baal, Elijah is involved in having, in separating them out, they gathered together, and they ended up killing the 400 false prophets in Carmel. As we all know, he takes them to Carmel, and that is totally resolved. Izebel, the wife of Achab, the queen, she's burning with anger, and she wants to totally kill Elijah the prophet. And Elijah decides to run away. And he runs away, and eventually he makes his way to Sinai. And there, the Bible describes how he ate, and he had the strength to go for 40 days, and reminds us, of course, is very similar to the whole story of receiving Torah on Sinai. He went for 40 days and 40 nights, and here he's going back to Sinai. This is very interesting. And there, God asks him, goes, Malach hafo Eliyahu, what are you doing here? And why do you come back to Sinai for? What's going on? Like, going back to Sinai, and he says right away, Kano kineti, he uses a double form of zealousy. I'm very zealous over, he's saying over, what they're doing to you, God. And he says, because they left your covenant, and that they destroyed your altars, and that the good prophets, the true prophets of Israel, were murdered, and therefore I remained alone, and I would like you to take me away. Literally, he wanted God to take him away from the world, and he runs away to, he runs away to Sinai, and he requests that from God. So what happens in that situation? And God eventually keeps challenging him, and I'm not going to go through the whole thing, and Elijah repeats this a couple of times. He's repeating it over and over again, that he has that zealousy, etc. So eventually, what does God say to him? God says to him, to go back. He sends him back. He tells him to anoint Hazael as king over Aram, and Yehu ben Nimshi is going to be over Israel as king, and Elisha ben Shaphat, the prophet Elisha ben Shaphat, from Mecholah, he's going to, I want you to anoint him instead of you. So it's another leadership being taken over Elijah. And from there, we see, it's a very fascinating teaching, we see that Elijah, for that moment, when he was burning with zealousy over what was done, by Izebel and Achab, and what was being done in Israel, the terrible things happening. They destroyed the altars, and they killed the murdering prophets, and all those things they're doing, leaving the covenant. So he felt that this can't go on, and he was being very zealous for God. But here, instead of God granting him with some kind of gifts and a reward, we see the opposite. Now God said, okay, you're done, and now Elisha's taking over. What happened over here? Why is this different response where of Pinchas, who could be even Eliyahu, as we say, according to certain opinions, why in that situation was he allowed the opposite? Not only was allowed to, he responded zealously, but he was granted a great gift of such longevity and the priesthood, all that as a result. So what's the difference of the two reactions? And I'd like to read, in order to understand this, I'd like to read just a few words of one of our famous commentaries. It's called Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, one of the ancient midrashim of Rabbi Eliezer ben Hukunus. He was a Tana, and he writes like this. He says, Amad Eliyahu barach me'eretz Yisrael v'nimlat. He says Eliyahu runs away from Israel and escapes. And he talks about that. And he brings down, talks about how God says to him, you were zealous, and God says to him, enough of your zealousy already. You were zealous in Shittim, you were zealous here now, and God says enough of that. And now what is God doing to Elijah the prophet? He says to him, Mikan itkinu chachamim. Here our rabbis established sheyu osim moshav kavod lemalach habrit, that they're going to make, when they do a circumcision, they're going to have a special place of honor for the angel of the covenant, and that's Elijah. Shneimar malach habrit asher tem chavetzim minei ba. Elohei Yisrael yachish v'yavi b'chayenu Mashiach l'lachamenu yichadesh levavenu shneimar v'yeshiv levavot al banim. So he's saying it should happen quickly. God should bring Messiah, etc. And it brings a verse from, which I'm going to quote in a moment, Malachi. But here we see the words of from Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer. He's saying that Eliyahu ran away from the land of Israel. He actually ran back to Sinai. He went back stages. I mean, we're supposed to make it from Sinai to the land of Israel. He runs away. So in reality, that's an answer to our question. And this is in a situation where Elijah was saying he was zealous and all this, but God, which obviously was in his heart, he was feeling these terrible things. But I think this is a very interesting insight I want to give here. In my opinion, is that here we see it's not enough to be zealous in your heart. God wants always actions, to take that initiative. We spoke about that. So if your actions are going to be, okay, you're very zealous, what they're doing to me, you're burning inside, which obviously he was a prophet and it was really burning inside, the terrible things, what they were doing. But here, instead of responding, trying to rectify the situation, he gave up. He totally had despair over here. And his despair led him to run away from Israel because he was afraid that Isabel, the queen, is going to have him killed and all this, and he was in fear. So that fear brought him to a situation of leaving the land of Israel, going back to Sinai, which was only sanctified for a particular time, right? There's a whole thing that happened when he was there. But he literally left and he went back to the Sinai experience. He ran away 40 days and 40 nights. Interesting. Obviously, we can explain in different directions this whole thing. I'm not going to explain the prophecy. There are different ways according to how would Maimonides explain the prophecy. Maimonides explains the prophecy is that something that's happening in a prophetic mode. In other words, he went to Sinai, not physically, it was a spiritual ascent and running away. Leaving Israel, leaving everything behind, the whole concept. I assume that's how Maimonides would explain it, but we're not going in that direction now. But in reality, here, and I think this is a very good answer to the question I posed, why was Pinchas granted that gift and all that? Because he did not respond to his fear of what the head of Midian is going to do, the king of Midian's soul is going to do, because he killed a daughter, and he's not going to respond to what the tribe of Shimon is going to do, because he killed the head of the family, the prince of Shimon. But he said he's doing the right thing for the name of God. He's eliminating this evil and stopping the plague in Israel, right? So he was fighting against evil without thinking about the consequences, and he did not have any despair there. He wasn't. And when the story of Eliyahu, there we see something very strange. Was his despair, right? And it was really shocking that he ran away. And of course, the situation was terrible. But that's the whole thing. Sometimes in the hardest situations, we're in despair. We think there's no response. The answer is not to have despair and run away from our problems. We got to face them. Just like, as I'm saying, that's why I think in this portion we see a beautiful comparison of of Pinchas and Slofchad, the daughters of Slofchad, and the sons, the children of Korach. And we see those three instances very, very clear of how not running and facing conflict, not running away from conflict, right? There's an issue, you got to face it. The daughters knew how to face it, Slofchad, Pinchas knew how to face it. The children of, here they were in the pit. They said, let's just repent. Let's, again, I said they didn't know what was going to happen. The results, they did it for the, but they did actions. They truly repented. They turned around. They left that whole concept that the father was leading, which is the hardest thing in the world. I said for children of the own father was leading this rebellion, and they were able to overcome that. It was fascinating demonstration of repentance, and of course Joshua in his own way in his tent and serving again and not thinking about anything and resulted in great results. But when you are running away, from the problem, you're not solving the problem. And here it's fascinating is that Elijah the prophet, we know, never dies. Right? He goes up to heaven directly, waiting for to return. And we see that there's something very special and powerful here about Malach HaBrit, the angel of the covenant, is where that God says, we see the prophecy of the end of the prophets, Malachi, one of the great prophets. He brings down in chapter 3, verses 22 to 24. And I'll read some of those verses. I'll just read already why not read all three of them? Zechut Torah Moshe, remember the Torah of Moshe Rabbeinu, Avdi, my servant. Asher tziviti oto b'chorev, which I commanded him in Chorev, on Sinai. Al Kol Yisrael, Chukim Mishpatim I've given. Remember the Torah. Don't forget the Torah of Moshe Rabbeinu. And then right after that he's saying, Hinei anochi sholeach lachem et Eliyahu Navi. I'm sending you Elijah the prophet. Now what's the connection of Elijah and the Torah of Moshe? I'm happy I read the verse. It's very important because we see that is his rectification. That's where he went back to, and that's where he failed. That's where he stopped being temporarily the major prophet of Israel, right? And therefore God says, I'm going to send again Elijah the prophet. Before the great day of judgment. He's going to bring back the hearts of the children on the fathers and the hearts of the fathers on the children. And pen avovi ketet haaretz cherem gavbet vekam, and I destroy the land. In other words, the end of days, the judgment, the end of days is based on Elijah returning to bring back the children to the fathers and the fathers. So there's not going to be any more despair now. And the reason I say this is such an important message is because if you're living here in Israel, on the land more than anything, but in any country of the world feels this. Here in Israel, we know we're in the land of prophecy, the land of the future of Israel, and the whole future of the world comes out of Israel. The redemption and all that, it's all here. This all happens in the land, and this, of course, brings out to the entire world the blessing. So what's going to happen at the end of days, which is for this series period at the end of days, is that God is saying we can't have despair anymore. When you see the worst things in the world going on, we can't just sit there and blah, 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 and have despair. We can't run away from it. What we have to do is we have to stand up and learn for those to take initiative in how to rectify the situation. And eventually Elijah is going to come back and lead that rectification. And here we see it has so much to do with what? With bringing back the hearts. Bringing back the hearts for fathers on sons and sons on fathers. It's all about that love of Hashem that we have to instill within our fathers and our children. And that will bring about the redemption. No more despair. Shabbat Shalom, B'Sorot Tovot, Yeshurut V'Nechama.